here is every movie that I watched in January. First, I started the month off with Before Sunrise, and this movie is really incredible and probably one of the best movies I have ever seen. And you should definitely go watch this movie, and I don't want to give anything else away. Next, I watched The Girl Who Knew Too Much. So I wanted to watch more Giallo films outside of Dario Argento, and this was pretty alright. I think that Argento definitely has the style that I wanted from this type of movie, but I was also pretty uninterested with the story. Then I watched Poltergeist, and I think that it's a pretty crazy take of mine, but I didn't really understand this movie very much, and I think I would have wanted more of a Texas Chainsaw type movie from Toby Hooper, and I felt like I got more of a Steven Spielberg movie. Then I watched Jeepers Creepers, which is a horror movie staple that I am just getting around to. And I don't know if this movie deserves the status that it does because I don't think it is anything special and is mostly an early 2000s horror movie. Next, I watched Before Sunset, and this is one of the best movies ever made. Again, just like the first one, and probably even better than the first one. And it's amazing, and you should definitely go watch it. Then I watched The Queen's Gambit, which I have not finished, but is not really that great. I think that it is pretty overrated. For a TV show, it isn't too bad, but I'm not the biggest fan of TV shows, and it didn't really do anything for me. Then I watched Jeepers Creepers 2, which is not very good of a movie. And for horror movie sequel, there are worse ones, but doesn't really do anything special, and I probably won't be watching 3 or 4 considering they're supposed to be worse. Next, I watched The Color Out of Space, and I really like Nicolas Cage, but this movie isn't super special to me, and I think doesn't really do anything too crazy. While there are some really cool colors um and the and again there are among the colors, but overall this movie didn't really do anything for me, but some of the colors are very cool. Then I finally watched Okja, which is one of the last Bong Joon-ho films I need to see, and this was pretty fun. Not a masterpiece like many of his other movies, but a pretty entertaining, solid movie. Next, I watched Mandy, which is one of my favorite movies I have seen this month, and this movie is a lot of fun, and has a great performance by Nicolas Cage, and a great direction by Panos Cosmatos. And back to back after Mandy, I saw another one of my favorite movies of this month. I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which I think is a super underrated movie to come out during COVID, and probably the best movie to come out during COVID. This movie is really crazy and is a complete nightmare, but it is a really well done movie, and you should definitely go check it. Then I watched Sing Street, which I didn't quite understand. There is some good songs in here, and there are some cool vibes going on, but movie didn't really do anything for me other than that, and I could not quite understand and connect with characters. Then surprisingly, after a long time, I finally watched Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which is just as full of imagination and color and candy as I thought it would. Then I finally watched Fargo, which is a really good movie. Even though I was quite tired while watching it, I could still see that this is a great movie and deserves its classic status. Then I watched a short film on YouTube called Thingu, which is a parody of the movie The Thing, and there's some good stop motion animation, even though it is 1 minute, and while you're probably going to forget about this movie that you even watched it, or short, it is fairly cute. And then I watched Vivarium, which I, at the moment, didn't mind this movie, but after a long time, the movie really got old. Um, and the kid character has to be one of the most annoying characters ever put to film. And there is some cool things going on with the concept and the overall atmosphere, but other than that, it is super hard to watch. Then I watched Ad Astra, which I I didn't know how I would feel about this movie, considering that a lot of people did not like it, but came out absolutely loving it, and I think this movie is super underrated, and I think that it might have gotten the wrong audience with its trailer, and I think that it is super well done, and the effects are incredible. And then I rewatched the movie Aftersun, and on a rewatch, this definitely cements it as one of my favorite movies of all time. I think this movie is absolutely incredible in every way. And then I also rewatched Donnie Darko, which is a 2000s classic, and it is still really fun. Definitely not as good as I remember it being, but it is still a very well done movie, and Jake Gyllenhaal is great in it. Then I watched One Cut of the Dead, which I had heard was a really good movie, but watching it, I didn't quite understand it. The last half hour makes a lot of sense and brings the whole movie together and is absolutely incredible, but the rest of the movie is a slog to get through and is one of the worst first half hours I've seen in a long time for a movie, so it has to bring it down, but I wish I liked this more. And then I watched Twilight Zone, the movie, which I've never seen the show or many anthology shows. I have seen a couple anthology movies, maybe. But this movie, I don't know if I like anthology that much. I didn't really do anything for me, but there was some cool moments and a couple decent segments. And then I watched Joker 2. And Joker 2, can't pronounce the name, is not very good of a movie, even though I will admit it tries something really interesting by making it a musical. I think making it a musical is a great idea, especially with its two leads, but they didn't decide to do anything with it besides musical numbers. And the movie is pretty boring and hard to get through. And then I watched Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again, which is a absolute blast. I was disappointed that Meryl Streep was not in the sequel and didn't watch it for a long time after watching the first one because of it. But after watching the second one, I will admit it is a great movie on its own and a whole lot of fun. For anyone who has only seen the first one, they should definitely see the second Mamma Mia. And then I watched Shrek the Third, which is a pretty horrible movie in every way. The first movie is a really good movie. The second one, while having flaws, is pretty funny. And the third one isn't funny and isn't good in any way. This movie is not enjoyable, and I don't understand why a lot of people seem to really like this movie. And then I watched a pretty forgotten Oscar-nominated movie, The Mississippi Burning, which does have Willem Dafoe, and he does great in it, but the movie was pretty uninteresting besides that. Then I watched The Holdovers, which I didn't really love. Sadly, I didn't really get this movie, even though I think it was pretty charming and funny, and the performances were great. It didn't really connect to me in any other way. And then I watched Shrek Forever After, preparing for the fifth movie, and just as the third one, this movie is absolutely atrocious, maybe even worse than the third one. This movie has no redeeming qualities, is not funny, and does not have a good story. Then on my rewatch Star Wars marathon, I watched Return of the Jedi, which unlike the first two, I don't think is that special, but there's some really great moments in the movie, but the overall movie doesn't work that much, but I understand its classic status, but it's nowhere near as good as the first two. Then I watched Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express, which sadly I did not quite understand. And I looked at the director and I looked at the scores and thought I would really, really like it. I've never seen a Wong Kar-wai film before, but it seemed like something I would really like. But sadly, I didn't quite get it. There is some really good things going on here, but it wasn't my personal favorite. And then I watched A Charlie Brown Christmas, which even though it is not Christmas, I decided to watch. And this movie is absolutely incredible. Even though it's short, it is absolutely cute, and the animation is great. Well, not might some people right now might not think it's too impressive, but for the time, it is super well done, and it is a Christmas classic and deserves all the love in the world. And then finally, the last Lord of the Rings movie I had to watch was Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. I've already seen these movies, but I decided to rewatch them. It has been a long time, and this movie is really good. Just like the first two, it's really good. But compared to the first two, I think I like the first two a bit more on a rewatch, and I think this movie is very, very long and sometimes hard to get through, but it is super well done, um, And then I watched the 2019 movie Greener Grass, which I was pleasantly surprised and absolutely loved it. I think it is absolutely hilarious and is very weird, and some people might not enjoy it, but it is very good for what it is, and its target audience will absolutely love it. And then I had to watch To Kill a Mockingbird for school, and maybe it is just me, but I didn't quite get this movie and couldn't quite get into it, but I will admit it has a lot of redeeming qualities and is a well done movie. And then I rewatched Stand By Me, which is a really great movie, and um and there's a lot of movies very similar to this, including it and the TV show Stranger Things. And while those movies and TV shows might be good and or even great, none of them ever come close to this original movie Stand By Me. And I think this movie is great and holds up very well today. Next, I watched the remake of the Speak No Evil, and this movie is one of my least favorite movies of all time. Well, this movie definitely had great reviews coming movie had great reviews. I personally don't think it is good whatsoever. I think that this movie represents everything bad about American remakes, just packing up the action and losing all the atmosphere and tension. The movie is not scary, unlike the first one that is a super disturbing horror movie. The movie is not disturbing, not scary, and not good in the slightest. And then I watched Red Rooms, which is I'm pretty sure a French horror film from 2024, even though it does say 2023, came out in America. I'm pretty sure in 2024. I'm not really sure how it works, but this movie is really good. It is very creepy and very well done. Definitely one of the best movies of the last 10 years, maybe. I'd say more of the 2020s, and this movie is really great. And then I watched Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, which I honestly absolutely adored. It reminded me a lot of Evil Dead 2, and that is one of my favorite movies of all time. But this movie does not quite reach that level, but does come close with that final act. This movie is an absolute blast, but if you get grossed out by the sight of blood, this movie is not for you, and do not watch it because this movie is super bloody. And then in honor of David Lynch, I watched his short film David Lynch Cooks Quinoa, and this short film is really great and really shows how great of a director this guy is, because just a short of him cooking food is super entertaining than most blockbusters and most movies in general. You can just hear him talk for hours and never get bored. And then I watched the movie Dead Snow, which did remind me a lot of Evil Dead, and it was obviously obviously inspired by Evil Dead, but this movie does not quite get there anywhere near the level of those two movies. While it tries to have that type of humor and tries to pull off the same things, it doesn't really do anything like that. Very not so much inspired by Evil Dead 2, but more by Evil Dead. And I did not quite get this movie. I understand why some people might like it, but I do feel like it's just a worse version of those movies. And then I watched the 2003 short film Saw, which is by many people considered Saw 0.5 because it is the short film that basically happened before the movie, directed by James Wan. And for a long time, I didn't know this short existed, and I think this is a really cool showcase of what the first movie was going to be. But considering that, it is just a worse version of the first movie with less of a budget. But it is a really creative idea, especially for the time. And then I watched Dead Snow 2, which I was really excited to see. Considering it had great reviews by many people and supposed to be better than the first one. And starting off with the movie, I think it reminded me a lot of Evil Dead 2, which is a great compliment, but this movie is basically just a watered down version of that movie, and is not funny and not enjoyable at the slightest. And then I watched Wes Anderson's short The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar, which was a lot of fun, super fast paced, and doesn't really let you go. It is fairly short, but it even feels shorter than its runtime. The movie runs super smoothly and is super well done. And then I rewatched one of the best movies ever made, Evil Dead 2, which I cannot add to how great this movie is because everyone's already said how great it is, and this movie is perfect from start to finish, absolutely hilarious in every way, the best movie ever. And then I watched the found footage horror movie Lake Mungo, which I think was absolutely incredible. I think this movie absolutely is disturbing and absolutely got to me. This movie is super emotional and super scary, and it was probably one of the most scary movie I've ever seen in my entire life. This movie is so hard to watch for anyone that gets scared easily or doesn't like sad movies. And this movie is very sad and very, very scary, but super, super well done, and is one of the best found footage horror movies ever made. And then this is the first movie I watched in the theater for 2025. And this movie, sadly, even with the director who directed The Invisible Man, which I liked, and Upgrade, which I thought was really fun, but this movie is not fun and not good. This movie is not very good, and maybe even worse than the 2010 Wolfman. I'm not going to go into detail since a lot of people probably haven't had the chance to see this movie yet, but it is not a good movie, and you probably should just wait for streaming to see this movie. And then finally, I watched Fallen Angels, and I was pretty hesitant going in, considering I didn't like Wong Kar-wai's other film, Chungking Express, that much. But this movie is one of the best movies I have seen this month, one of my favorite movies probably of all time now. This movie is absolutely incredible, and for some reason this movie really worked. It makes me think that I have to go back to Chungking Express, and I was probably just not ready for it. Maybe this movie is a bit more wider audience, I'm not really sure. And then I watched one of the earliest found footage movies ever made is Ghostwatch, which is a really good movie and one of the best found footage movies ever made, just as Lake Mungo. And this movie has a really interesting style and really interesting approach to a found footage movie and is really enjoyable, and a lot of people haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it and you are a horror fan or found footage fan, this movie is really fun and really good. And then I watched the 1985 Clue, which I did not expect to be one of the best movies and one of my favorite movies of all time. This movie is super funny and so incredible, and it is super smart, and from start to finish, it does not give you a break to breathe. It is very good. It's one of the only times I've ever done this, but I watched this movie the very next day because it is just that good. And then I watched the anime film Vampire Hunter D, which was a very cool concept, and the animation was cool, but the overall was pretty flat to me and didn't really have anything too interesting in it, that anything keeping me connected to these characters, but there was some interesting things going on here. And then I watched the film Aragorn on Disney Plus because I had really nothing else to do, and this movie just made me more bored than I was to begin with. This movie is horrible and a absolute disaster. And then I watched the sequel to Vampire Hunter D, Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, and this is a lot better than the first one. A lot of people have the only reason why I watched the first one was because a lot of people say this movie is absolutely incredible, and to me this movie did not quite hit that mark for me, but I think that it does a lot more with the concept and makes you care about the characters a whole lot more. Next, I watched the new movie 2024 Mads, which I thought I was going to absolutely adore from the premise to a lot of things people were saying about this movie. I thought it would be a classic of 2024, but I just didn't quite get it. I found it super uninteresting and went way too long, and I was pretty bored by the end of it. And then I watched the Hulu film Hold Your Breath, which, again, feels like a Hulu film. It's one of those Netflix original films that really aren't very good and very bland and almost nothing there, but they always seem to have some cool concepts but never do anything with them. And then I watched David Lynch's A Straight Story, which this movie is absolutely incredible. This movie is probably one of my favorites of him, even though I haven't seen too many movies from him. This movie proves what a great director he is for one of his most unknown movies. And then I watched 2024's Ariel Payne, which this movie is one of my favorites of the year so far for sure, or last year for sure, but I'm just catching up with some of the movies that year, and this movie is really enjoyable and is super great from start to finish. And then trying to watch most of Martin Scorsese's filmography, I watched Silence, which is a fairly recent movie that seems like a lot of people hadn't seen, and this movie is pretty good. I didn't quite love it, and it wasn't really my thing compared to some of his other movies, but it is super well done and shot very well. Then for my Star Wars rewatch, I rewatched The Phantom Menace, which going into it, rewatching it, I was hoping that I would really like it, considering that a lot of people nowadays tend to look back on these movies fondly, but when I rewatched it, I thought it was absolutely atrocious and super, super boring. The only good scene in this entire movie that isn't an absolute garbage is the ending lightsaber battle, which I thought was very, very good, but the rest of the movie is super annoying, super boring, and super hard to watch. And then I watched the Dario Argento film Opera, which is one of the biggest movies of him that I have not seen yet. And this movie is a whole lot of fun and super well done. I love Giallo movies. I love Dario Argento, and this movie is really good. And then for school, I watched The Philadelphia Story, which just like To Kill a Mockingbird, I didn't quite love. Maybe it's just me, but I didn't really get into the story, but I thought this movie was pretty funny. And then I watched John Carpenter's Escape from LA. I've seen a lot of movies from this guy. I'm trying to watch as many as I can, but this movie isn't necessarily anywhere near one of his best. But I think this movie is a little overhated and is a bit of fun if you let it. And then I watched the Ryan Gosling film, The Gray Man, which this movie is absolutely horrible and is one of the worst movies I have ever seen. This movie is super bland and super dull. I love Ryan Gosling, but this is his worst movie, and I hope that he can redeem himself. But he has. He has many times redeemed himself, and just by his past movies make up for this movie. But I'm not blaming him because I think he's still a good actor and does fine in this. And then I watched the Japanese film Houseu, which is maybe my favorite movie I have seen this month. This movie is a absolute blast and a really well done horror movie, and it is just super weird and super out there. If you don't like this type of thing, then you probably wouldn't like this. But if you do like this type of horror comedy, you should probably look it up a bit about this movie before you get into it and watch it, because you might not like it. But if you think you would like this type of thing, you will absolutely love it. Then I watched Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, which I really do like The Holy Grail, and I enjoyed 12 Monkeys, but this movie I did not quite get into. There is some cool things going on here, and some very interesting elements here, and some very original ideas, but this movie doesn't quite hold up super well as a whole. Then I watched the classic film Carrie, which I was hoping I was absolutely going to love, but I didn't quite love it. I think this movie is very well done, but for its classic status, I didn't quite love it like everyone else. I definitely think that another Brian De Palma film, Phantom of the Paradise, deserves all the love and more over this movie, but it's fine because this movie is still very good. And then I watched a pretty unknown movie called The Amish Murder. I was pretty bored, and I saw this on Disney Plus that it had Neve Campbell in this movie, and that's really the only reason why I watched it. And this movie is pretty much nothing without her in it. Then I watched the movie The Dark Crystal, which I absolutely adored. I feel like this movie has is one of the most impressive movies ever made, and I think that is one of the best fantasy films ever made, and even better than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think this movie is super underrated and deserves a lot of love, and is one of the best made movies ever made. Maybe not one of the best movies, but one of the best made movies ever made. Then on Netflix, I watched the first episode of American Primeval, which was nothing special at all, even though there was some cool action sequences for the first episode, and it did remind me a lot of The Revenant. This really didn't do anything. Maybe it's just me and I don't like TV shows that much, but I didn't quite like this. And almost at the end here, I watched the 2021 Candyman, and going into it with a lot of mixed reviews, I was not sure where I would land, but I ended up enjoying this movie quite a bit. It's not as good as the first movie and has plenty of issues, but I think it is a well done horror movie. And then finally, the last movie I watched this month was Millions, which is another Danny Boyle film that I hadn't seen. And this movie isn't that great in almost any way, and maybe I can see why some people enjoyed it, but I didn't really understand this movie very much, and like a lot of his other movies better. So Evil Dead 2 is not the last movie I watched this month. But I am using it to represent Ash versus the Evil Dead, which I totally forgot existed. So I decided to watch the first episode of Ash versus the Evil Dead. And Ash versus the Evil Dead is pretty fun, but it doesn't really quite have the energy of the original trilogy. But since I am a huge fan of the original trilogy, it was a fun treat to have after watching those three. I could see more Evil Dead. If you're wondering my score, I would probably give it a 3.5. Pretty solid, but not the 5 stars that is the original second one.